welcome everyone to Color Commentary. We are your Pauper commentators, Michael Petchik and Adrian Guarzales. How's it going, Adrian?
Pretty good, Mike. How are you?
I can't complain, really. Just working on career stuff, trying to get my
Doing
button gear.
business?
Yeah, doing the business.
Give him the business, Mike.
Giving them all the business. All right.
Give our listeners the business.
Yeah, let's give you the upkeep business. So first off, the show is brought to you in part by Original Magic Art. Original Magic Art has all sorts of great playmats, dice bags, tokens, and even art prints of assorted magic art and art from the rest of the world as a whole. And coming soon, they may actually have playmats of Meddling Mage. If you check them out on Twitter at Original Magic Art, they are soliciting options that they might turn into playmats. And Josh is actually a really great guy. So if you toss an idea his way and he likes it, he may just try and get in contact with the artist. So that is super, super cool. And they make really great products. I think that their classic art tokens are just phenomenal. And we stand by their products. We, as an affiliate, though, have an affiliate code. So if you go to their website and you enter the code Commontary, all caps, spelled as it is in the name of this podcast, when you're checking out, you're going to get 5% off. The show's going to get a little bit of a kickback. So not only do you get a discount on your wonderful new tokens or dice bags or playmats or art prints or all of the above, you're helping support the show. So once more, that code is Commontary. All caps, spells it as it is in the name of this podcast. That'll get you 5% off. What do you got for us, Adrian?
All right. Well, the other thing that we do is we have a Patreon. For just $1 an episode, you too can hear the full show, including the pre and post shows, and get access to our Patreon-exclusive Discord channel. The other thing we're doing right now is for my birthday, which is in 10 days as a day of recording. If we get up to $100 an episode, we will give away a free playmat to one lucky winner in the drawing. As of time of recording, we are currently at $93, so just 7 more to go, and we'll give away that playmat. So yeah, Patreon is great. And I also got another little announcement for us, Mike. Do you mind if I go ahead here?
Yeah, go for it. This is exciting, and it's something that I think people have asked for, and we're glad to be able to provide finally.
Yeah. In a world where there is a plane where only common spells can be played, it is only just that the most common feature be battle. Head to the plane of common area for our versus videos with the Austin Playgroup, a.k.a. the people I play Pauper with all the time. Okay, all right, I'll stop the movie voice. Basically, we're coming out with a new video series that we'll be posting to YouTube where we will be showing games, paper games of Magic, with the Austin Pauper group, or Float to Gush, as we like to call ourselves. And we'll be posting to YouTube with some commentary from the players afterwards. So the idea is that you'll watch the match with the players commentating after the match. So they'll be telling you what they were thinking, what they were doing. We've got some great talent here in the city, so I'm pretty excited to do it. Actually, after this recording, we're going to go ahead and be doing that. You, the listener, will probably not see it. I don't know. We don't really have a release schedule yet, but look forward to that in the future on the Color Commentary YouTube channel, Common Area. It's going to be great.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this. I'm going to try to help out as much as I can. Obviously, I'm not there, so I can't really help with the actual physical setup, but we're going to try and make sure that this content is brought to you in a timely manner and, you know, is up to our usual high standards of only the best.
I mean, we are the Premier Pauper podcast, Mike. Why can't we also be the Premier Pauper YouTube channel?
Exactly. Yeah, so look for that coming soon. Hopefully very soon if everything goes according to plan.
And what do you have?
What do I have? Brief announcement, since a while ago we talked about them. Some of the commons from Battle Bond are showing up on MitGo. If you were extremely excited to brew with some of these cards, some of them will be arriving in a little bit. Not like
soon? Question
soon.
Mark?
They're coming on July 5th. And
that's like a month from now.
Yeah, it's a pretty long release period for those to get to MitGo. Relevant cards, the commons that we're getting are Aurora Champion, Azura Blade Seeker, Combo Attack, Sickle Dancer, Soaring Show Off, Bull Rush Bruiser, and that looks like it. Oh, and Saltwater Stalwart, which is frankly one of the worst card names I've ever had to pronounce on this show. We're not going to tell you exactly what these do. None of these were cards that we highlighted when we spoke about this set as a whole, but if any of these caught your eye during spoiler season, they will be available on the 5th. So without any further ado or other announcements to get in the way, we've got a topic for today. And Adrian, why don't you introduce us to this topic?
Yeah, why don't I? So friend of the show, the Maverick Girl, sorry to rip off of you, by the way, put out an article earlier today as of day of recording about preparing for a big event, like namely what types of decks you might see at the upcoming GP Vegas Pauper Championship event. Sadly, neither of us are going. But that sort of led Mike and I to have a conversation, on our Discord with our patrons about sort of getting ready for big events in general, and then that sort of spawned more of a conversation between me and Mike, and we decided that it not only is it going to be some people's first GP, probably, maybe listeners of the show, but it's definitely going to be one of the first big Pauper events that folks are going to go to. And I know that we can count probably Card Kingdom in that number, but I really think that this event's going to be bigger than that. You know, it's going to be huge. It's going to be probably the biggest Pauper event to date.
Yeah, so SCGCon is being billed as like a huge event, and obviously GP Vegas has historically proven to be one of the highest attended Magic events of the year. These are going to be massive events, and they differ a little bit, and a lot of people play Miko as their only way that they contact the game. So if you're trying to go to one of these paper events for the first time, it is going to be an adjustment. There's going to be things that are different, and we're kind of hoping that this episode is sort of a primer on like, hey, I'm going to go play Magic at this huge event, and I'm going to play Pauper. What do I do?
And actually, sort of in that same vein, I was talking to Aaron when we were in Japan recently. Sorry to keep bringing that trip up. And he was a little sad because he didn't do as well as he'd wanted to. And he said, you know, I grind all the time on Moto. I 5-0 constantly. Like, I'm a pretty good player. He's like, but I think I've really learned all that Moto has to teach me. When you come to a GP, like, you really are playing on day 2, especially, like, a higher caliber of player than even you might meet in Magic Online. And there's also so many other things you have to worry about. Your body, for example, judge calls, accidental slips, cheating. Like, there's so many things that you have to consider when you're sitting down at a huge paper event that you don't really have to think about at F&M or when you're playing Magic Online that really change the dynamic of the game. And I know that, you know, the metagame is traditionally thought of as what decks are my opponents playing, but there is also like a real life metagame component to going to these huge events.
The metagame, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So there are just a bunch of other factors you have to consider. And so Mike and I have been to a couple of GPs ourselves, never anything more major than that, but I think that we do have some knowledge that we can pass on to you, the listener.
Yeah, and one of the first things we want to bring up is card legality, and this goes out more to people who are slightly less familiar with Pauper in general, but could apply to people who have been playing casually or haven't always been quite so keyed in. So both of these events are utilizing the MitGo card pool, and Adrian, you actually brought up this is actually the official WotC line, isn't it?
Yeah. So, if you want to get a little bit deeper, Wizards considers Pauper to really only be a Magic Online format, but if you go to the Wizards Pauper format page, one moment here, it says, in this Magic Online format, all cards must have been printed at common rarity in a Magic Online set or product. So that is the lead that these huge retailers have taken. You know, it used to be that we would talk about the Card Kingdom ban list and how that was sort of the big Pauper event. Those days are kind of over. Channel Fireball and Star City Games are setting the trend now because they're by sheer fact that they're introducing so many more people to the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it is important that people, you know, just double check your deck lists. And one of the great tools I can actually recommend is if you have questions about a card, obviously you can hop on to Gatherer. I will also take a moment to plug Scryfall, which is my go-to Magic search engine. And
I will say Gather is not accurate because if you go on Gather and look up, say, Tormod's Crypt, it says it's a common printing in Chronicles. It would require you to know that Chronicles was not printed on Magic Online.
so there's actually a tab if you're a diehard Gatherer user. There's a tab called Sets and Legality, which I believe does accurately reflect it. But if I would just recommend just skip that step, go to scryfall.com. Search the name of the card, and once you're on the page for that card, it will have a section about legality, and it'll either say legal or not legal or banned. Obviously, the banned list is pretty easily accessible, but for gray areas, for example, the difference between Blue Elemental Blast and Hydroblast, one of them is legal, one of them isn't. So please just do yourself a favor and don't jeopardize your whole event because you didn't bother to double check and make sure that, you're not playing something that is a common only in paper.
I'm not trying to gotcha here, Mike. You are correct that there are legalities for cards on Gather, but Pauper is not one of the formats that they include in that.
Oh, really? It doesn't actually.
It is Modern, Legacy, Vintage, and Commander. So not even Brawl is on there.
Huh. Weird. I would have.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm assuming that there's a little bit more going into that than there actually is. But here we are. We all goof.
Yeah. No, I like I said, I wasn't trying to gotcha you. I just really Scryfall is just the better place to check objectively.
Yeah, they really do an amazing job. They actually, not to shill too much here, but they did just implement foreign language compatibility as well. So if you're not a native English speaker and are going to one of these events, you can do that in your own native tongue.
And if you don't want to do that, just crib a list off of MTG Goldfish. That's the easiest thing.
That in reality, if you're fresh to the format, you're probably going with something like that. But just something to get out of the way at the head of things to make sure that people aren't just showing up and losing as a result of the fact that they didn't bother to check legality. All right. Adrian, I feel like you have gone to more GPs and large events than I have. What tips do you have just in terms of keeping yourself, sane and healthy during the course of one of these large events?
Bring your own snacks. Marine Bro brought Quest bars to Japan, and God, I wish I had those Quest bars sometimes. Being able to just chow down real fast between rounds is really key. Like if you go to time in a round, you're not going to have that much time before you have to go to the next round. So staying hydrated, staying fed, those are important. If you're in a group, that's sort of ideal for me because you're able to catch up with your friends and ask how the matches went. And if you do have a significant amount of downtime, that can really help out. So just staying refreshed, I think, is really the key one there. If you are willing to shell out the extra dough, I think most of these events, or at least the Channel Fireball ones, have like a Planeswalker lounge where you can go relax. Being able to just have a free place to sit down and have a drink of water goes a really, really, really long way. So I would recommend that. And also a tip I learned a while back, and I really hate to have to give this one out, is how to keep track of your stuff. Whenever I sit down at a GP, I loop my backpack strap around my leg. Because, like it or not, theft does happen at these events. And so I would just recommend not leaving your stuff unattended. When you sit down, loop your backpack around your leg so no one can kick your backpack out from under you and take off with it. Just play it pretty close to the chest. I like to see the good in all people, but, people have been robbed at these things before. So just a word of caution. I would recommend knowing where the bathrooms are. That's really key, especially because they can get kind of backed up towards the middle of the day. Really, a lot of my tips are going to be geared towards keeping yourself in top shape as opposed to actual gameplay. Be nice to your opponents. I know that can be kind of tough sometimes, but most people at GPs are there to have fun just like you. So developing a bit of a rapport with them goes a long way, especially in the Pauper events I played in. Most people are there. It's their first time playing Pauper. They typically tend to play something else. So they're, not bad or anything. They just maybe don't know the format that well, or they're seeing it as more of like a side event more than anything else. So I think keeping your opponents in mind is also a good one.
Yeah, I would definitely say try to be an ambassador for the format if you're already an enfranchised Pauper player. Try to make sure people are having a good time. Like at the end of the day, there is for these larger events, there are non-insignificant stakes on the line, but don't go out of your way to be nasty, and maybe go out of your way to in fact, be accommodating and make these people feel like they're having a good time.
And I'm going to segue into our next point here. Do not be afraid to call a judge. No one is going to think you're a snitch for calling a judge. And I think that is something people are a little scared of. But I'll do it, whenever. If there's any sort of disagreement between you and your opponent, call a judge over. Like, I don't care what it is. It could be something as insignificant as I don't really understand the wording of lifelink. I don't know. I'm making something up. But when in doubt over anything, call a judge. No one will think less of you.
Here's a more concrete example. Let's say my opponent casts an impulse. They resolve it, and then they go to put the cards on the bottom of their library, and they pick up their deck to shuffle it and start shuffling. That's a point where you should call a judge.
Well,
because that's not what that card does.
I feel like that's a really, really clear case of calling a judge. I have another one that maybe is going to be a little bit more of a no duh, but I this is actually something that happened to me, and I did call a judge over. I floated 2 and gushed, and my opponent didn't understand where my mana had come from. And I said, well, I tapped my 2 islands for mana, and then I returned them to my hand with gush, and I showed him the card. And he said, well, how do you still have the mana? And I was like, I'm just going to call the judge over, and he's going to explain this to you. So that's what I did.
Yeah, and don't call a judge over for every little thing, but if you're in a situation where you feel like you do not fully understand how things are functioning at that point in time, you should, or your opponent doesn't, call a judge over. That's what they're there for. They're there to make sure that this game gets played correctly. And this is something that I've heard from people who've played extensively on MitGo takes a little getting used to, because MitGo does have the added benefit of a mostly complete rule set, so that it handles a lot of these cases for you without you having to think about how these things resolve. So just be willing to call a judge over, because at the end of the day, your opponent should be understanding about this, and as long as you're not calling it a judge every 2 seconds, the judge will also be understanding.
Yeah, there's also a thing about like rules lawyering. Don't be a rules lawyer. That's where you try and gotcha your opponent when they, make a small mistake where you do understand their intent. Like not tapping their fetched land before cracking it. I don't know. Don't be a rules lawyer. That's totally different. But don't be afraid to call a judge over. And by the same token, if a judge gives a ruling you don't like, don't be afraid to appeal it. I have another anecdote that I can use. One of the other members of our play group here went to a GP in Toronto recently, and he had his deck checked, and he got a game loss because he was playing Affinity, and one of his cards was in the sideboard. And he said, I really don't think I did that. And in retrospect, I should have called the head judge, because it's totally possible that the original judge messed up somehow. So if a judge makes a call you don't like, or if something happens you don't like, absolutely feel free to appeal to the head judge. That's what they're there for. I will say, grain of salt, if the head judge makes a separate ruling, you're stuck with it no matter what it is. So the head judge is the end.
Yeah. And, again, it's a resource. Use it. And I hate to have to bring this up. If you think your opponent is outright cheating, call a judge. Like, obviously, again, as Adrian addressed, like to believe the best in people, but that's not always the case. If your opponent is doing something fishy, if they are, staring at their deck while they're shuffling it very intently, like things like that. Obviously, we can't give you a comprehensive list of the ways people can use sleight of hand to manipulate cards, but if you feel uncomfortable, just call over a judge. And you can couch it in something different if you don't feel comfortable like explaining to the judge in front of your opponent, hey, I think my opponent's doing something fishy.
I think you can even tell a judge you'd like a word with them in private.
Yeah, I've often seen in similar articles talking about this topic, like pull a card out of your sideboard and tell the judge you have a question that you don't want your opponent to hear. Bring the card with you and then just be like, hey, this guy's being really shady, and like I don't like how this feels. I think that there's something fishy going on here. I'd love if you could, just hang around and watch. It's just one of those things where, there are ways to handle this if you feel uncomfortable that are perhaps a little bit more comfortable for you. But definitely, if you think your opponent is actually cheating, please call a judge. That's, again, one of the reasons they are there.
The other thing that I want to end sort of our judge section on is don't worry. I know that we've sort of told you some horror stories here, but like at the end of the day, it's a game, and like it would some of these situations do suck. You'll notice that none of them actually happened to me. I've never had a bad experience with a judge. I've never had a bad experience with an opponent. I mean, I've had some uncomfortable ones, sure, where they get kind of salty, but nothing like in the realm of needing to call someone over to handle it. So relax, everything's gonna be fine. We're just giving you some tips to sort of steel yourself for the event, if you will.
Also, your judge will likely tell you this, but easiest way to get their attention: hand in the air and yell out "judge." That's the best way to do it. It's satisfying in its own little way. All right, so that's some of the more technical stuff. One of the things that I do want to talk about is for people who have played extensively in MitGo and perhaps have not played in Paper, demonstrating shortcuts. And this is a weird topic that we don't really have another reason to get into besides this episode. But Adrian, what comes to mind when I say demonstrating a shortcut?
So I'm gonna go back to the old days. Drake, on Moto, kind of click intensive. You had to flicker the Drake, flicker the wall, click on the Drake, click on the flicker in your graveyard, click on the lands. In Paper, you can just tell your opponent, "Oh, I'm doing this until I have 100,000 of each color of mana," and then your opponent's like, "Okay, I have no reaction to that." So it's much easier. When you can demonstrate a loop in Paper Magic, you're generally able to just say, "This is the game state I'm going to achieve with my loop." Splinter Twin's another great example of that. So it makes it much easier than having to click through each iteration of the loop repeatedly. So that being said, it makes certain decks in Paper better. Why don't you go ahead, Mike? It sounded like you were about to say something.
Oh, I was going to say I actually have a example from the Magic Judge Rules resources. And they define a shortcut as: tournament shortcuts involve skipping one or more priority passes to the mutual understanding of all players. So it is important that if you are going to shortcut something, that you explain it in a way that your opponent understands so that both of you can be on the same page. There's a handful of cards in Pauper that are on MitGo, involve a lot of clicking back and forth, passing priority back and forth, but one of the advantages of Paper is if both players are on the same page, you can make that process a lot shorter, and that is important when you're talking about instead of having the separate clocks that MitGo has, you are in a position where there is shared time, and if you go to time and round, you get 5 turns and that's it, and no one wants to draw a match. So make sure your opponent understands what you are doing and demonstrate the loop, and it'll save you time. But you did say there are decks that get better as a result of this. And one of those examples is Tortured Existence. For those folks joining us who might be newer to the format, Tortured Existence is a enchantment from way back in Stronghold, and it's a black for an enchantment that has an activated ability for 1 black, discard a creature card from your hand, return target creature from your graveyard to play. Now, there's a lot of lines in specifically the black-green version of this deck that involve a lot of stuff happening around this card, and being able to shortcut those is really helpful. One of the key examples is there's a card called Golgari Brownscale, which is 3 mana for a 2/3, but it has Dredge 3, and it also has the line of text: whenever it leaves a graveyard, whenever it's returned from a graveyard to its owner's hand, that player gains 2 life. So if you have one of these in your hand and one of these in your graveyard, you can cycle them back and forth and gain a bunch of life. Now on MitGo, what you'd have to do is each time you'd have to click on the Tortured Existence, click on the one in hand, click on the one in the graveyard, pay your black, and that completes 1 loop. You have to wait for your opponent to pass back priority. In Paper, if you have this set up and you have a bunch of black mana at the end of your opponent's turn, you could reveal the Golgari Brownscale in your hand and just say, I'm going to swap these X times, where X is the amount of black mana I have, and I'm going to gain twice that much life. And that can save you a ton of time on these actions. It also has interactions with Grave Scrabbler, a creature with madness, that when you cast it for its madness cost, gets something back from the graveyard. So you've got this thing where you go madness, Tortured Existence targeting something, discard my Grave Scrabbler, pay the madness cost. Grave Scrabbler has a triggered ability when it enters the battlefield, and you can kind of shortcut that a little bit. As long as your opponent agrees and is okay with it, you can do that. But
So because of this shortcutting, suddenly decks that are a little too click intensive for Moto become much better. We're not going to give you an exhaustive list, I don't think. But
I mean,
the big three are familiars in this deck to me.
Yeah, I think that familiars in this deck are the two lists in Paper that profit the most from this change in how combos work, where if you need to demonstrate a loop, you just can demonstrate the loop, and as long as your opponent understands everything, you're good to go. And I do think that that matters quite a bit in some matchups. Just being able to ensure that you don't go to time, wind up with that game, that match draw, and just generally provide a less miserable experience where if you go through every one of these actions, your opponent's just going to be sitting there for a while. It just generally benefits everything. Now, that does make these decks a little bit better. Does it make them tier 1? I'm not quite sure. And that's where we're going to get into the real meat of this topic. Adrian, what deck do I bring to this thing?
What a great question. So this is really the part that we got prompted off of the Maverick Girls article. She was coming at it from a kind of unique perspective on an article, which is, what cards are my opponents going to have? Most of the time when you go to a big event, that's not really something you consider. But because Pauper is so new, and because a lot of people probably have not invested a significant amount into the format who might be going to this Paper event, it's actually a great question. And so her ranking and my personal ranking, well, I'm going to say what my ranking is. I would expect to face off against a lot of red decks. People have the red cards. They're not exactly expensive. The deck is easy to put together. People understand it. And so in sort of that vein, if there's a deck that you play in another format, it's a fine choice for Pauper. And my comments in this section are going to be less for the enfranchised crowd and more for some of the people who might have found our show a little bit more recently. Because if you're an Is It Delver player on Moto, just drop $100 and buy Is It Delver in Paper. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you might as well.
There's always the factor of, if you've been grinding a deck for ages, you can probably like, I don't want to encourage this behavior. You could probably turn this episode off. Like, you should stick with that deck that you have a lot of experience with already, because you will just be more comfortable than trying to learn a deck in a week.
Yeah, but I'm talking to you. Yeah, you, the modern Elves player. We all know you're listening. You could just play Elves and Pauper. I would be looking at what cards do I already own that is easy for me to turn into a deck, because Pauper is a very, 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 very cheap format. I mean, I just told you to spend $100 to buy the tier 1 deck in the format. You're not going to find a better rate. But at the same time, I know some people are trying to pinch pennies. I know it's not exactly easy for some folks to just up and buy these decks. So if budget is a consideration, I think Red's a fine choice. I think that's why a lot of people choose it, especially in Paper. You see it quite a bit on Moto as well for the same reason. It doesn't typically do very well, but I think in an open... So the other thing that I want to talk about deck choice, and sorry, this might be jumping around a little bit, so I apologize if this isn't a coherent line of thought for the listener, but decks that don't do well on Moto, like we've already sort of discussed, can do fine in Paper because the field is so much more open. On Moto, you're probably going to play against Stompy, you're going to play against Boros, you're going to play against Delver, you're going to play against Tron, you're going to play against a lot of established archetypes. But because the format appeals so much to older players who might already have some of these card collections built up and don't know what to do with the 12 copies of Pestilence they have, they're going to think, well, maybe I'll play Black-White Pestilence, which is a fine deck, but the field is more open is really what I'm trying to get at here, because people are I think, a little bit more inclined to play their pet decks, because not only do they want to play the cards they don't get to play with a lot, but I think a lot of people still don't take the format that seriously. You know, it's not the actual GP, right? So I would expect to play a little bit more of a varied field, and so I think you should play a deck that has game against a lot of not tier 1 decks also. So I think Boros is great. I think, like I said, Mono Red is great. I think Delver is a great choice. I think Delver is the best deck against most decks. Am I making sense, Mike?
Yeah. I do think another point that's important to add here, people, I think, in part play their pet decks at these large events because they do represent something unique within our format. There aren't a lot of chances. Like if you have one land spy assembled, you're not likely getting a lot of chances to bust that deck out in paper. So if you're going to the GP anyway, you're probably going to want to play this side event. You're probably just going to go, well, I've got the thing, like I might as well. And I think that people are showing up to these events with a decent amount of just like the pet deck, the thing that you like doing in this format. And I think that that does lead to a broader field. When I was at GP Hartford, I saw a bunch of decks that I don't consider tier 1 or really even on my radar. There were a bunch of lists out there that were just a little bit odd. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think that you can no longer, for one of these events, instead of, you can't metagame it quite as hard as an online event where you're like, all right, well, I'm definitely going to see Is It Delver. I'm definitely going to see X, Y, and Z. Like you have an idea of like a certain amount of my matchups are likely to be X deck. And I think that that kind of gets a little tweaked. And I think that in part card prices in paper have affected that. And also, again, as you mentioned, just decks that people already own. Because if you look at a burn list, I think the average like burn deck for either modern or legacy, you're probably swapping like 20 cards, would you say?
Yeah, it's pretty close.
Yeah, you're not going that far. So if someone already has, I don't know, legacy burn built, like it's not a very big ask of them to pick up some other cards and just have access to this other event. And I did find at GP Hartford, there were a good chunk of people playing burn. It was more than I was expecting, to be totally honest. And I think that that is likely to hold true for other events of this type, where you have people showing up who want to play this event and, you know, retrofitted burn. And I think as a result, there are decks that benefit from that. So what decks fare particularly well against burn decks?
I think Delver, you have a lot of Hydroblast and counterspells. I think any deck that's looking to gain some life, Ralligond, for example. Boros, I think, has some good matchup against burn. You have a lot of damage prevention stuff. You can play Cop Red. You can gain life off your game lands. I don't know. Red decks are actually pretty easy to stop in Pauper, in my opinion. Game lands make them a little bit more iffy.
Yeah, I think specifically one of the ones I want to talk about, and we touched on it already, I think Tortured Existence is much, much better in paper than it at these large style events than it ever has been on Midgo.
I think Tortured Existence, I think you're right. Tortured Existence is a toolbox deck. And, you know, we're friend of the show, E-Hustle, has given us some great Tordex advice. I think the best piece of advice that he's ever given me is don't build around Tortured Existence.
Yeah, build yourself a black-green mid-range deck that, if it sticks to Tortured Existence, goes absolutely nuts.
But so too many decks, I think, try and bank on just resolving Tortured Existence and winning, and so they can't win without it. So I think you want to build your deck to really accommodate, you know, not necessarily having to draw Tortured Existence. And we've made that criticism of the deck before as well, where it's not as good, but I think that can come down to deck building as well. That's also a great deck for all the brewers out there to really make a list their own. Tortured Existence is very customizable.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the benefits. You can really tech out this list to like the point where you're almost playing 60 card EDH with it. But I think that in a way that does help when you're looking at this broad unknown field that may be very close to the Mitgo metagame. It may look nothing like it. But if you have all these answers that serve as fine creatures, and if you get your like engine online, just go nuts, I think that's where this deck really shines. I think in these types of events, it just has this substantial leg up that it will never really truly have. That combined with the fact that you do get to shortcut a lot of these actions, make it so that you're less likely to worry about like, oh man, I'm about to time out because, you know, I've had to click through 16 different actions on my opponent's end step. So I think that that's a deck that I would like. The next time I am at a GP, if there's a Pauper event there, I'm probably going to toss together Tordex, just because I do think that it's a deck that winds up being a lot better in these types of events. And I think mid-range in general gets a little bit better because the mid-range deck is designed to be that. It's designed to be as close to 50-50 with every other deck as it possibly can be, and benefits as a result of that. So I guess you're a big fan of Boros. How would you feel about taking that into like one of these slightly burn heavy, slightly all over the place events?
I think Boros is an excellent choice. It is game against a lot of decks, and it rewards deck knowledge, if that makes sense. It's a deck that is game against a lot of decks, is I think what I really want to say about it. So, the burn suite is very good. The creature package is good. You're doing a good blue impression. So I think it's one of the better choices.
Now, I do want to talk about a deck that I think I have played at a GP and felt underperformed pretty drastically. And that's Tron, like specifically the Marasatron style of lists. I threw one of these together for Hartford, and I ran into decks that just didn't line up well with the removal that I had at the time. And I think that's kind of an issue. Like with a broader metagame, your like teched out Marasatron list kind of loses some points when it comes to making sure that your answers fit.
That's kind of interesting because I think that's one of the strengths of Tortured Existence. So I really kind of want to unpack what we mean by teching out your Tron deck isn't as good. I think that the reason Tron is successful on Moto is because it is designed to beat a specific meta. Whereas with Tordex, you can just be like, well, I sort of have answers to everything. Whereas Tron is like, well, I have answers to the top decks. So if you don't face the top decks, you do less well as a result. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there in that it's a deck that when you have an idea of what the metagame is going to be, you can tech it out, put in these one-ofs, put in these like teachings targets, and really go to town and have a good time because you've planned according to what you are expecting to see. With these events, there's always the chance, like I legitimately at one of the events in Hartford saw someone playing an unsleeved standard Pauper deck in a Pauper event. So that deck I feel probably would have actually been not the worst against the Tron deck I was running because my answers had been so specifically chosen to answer specific decks that I expected to see. And I think at the end of the day, with a deck like Marasatron that relies a lot on like key removal as well as picking out specific spells that are going to line up well against your opponent's spells, I think it loses some points compared to Tortured Existence, where at the end of the day, Tortured Existence plays a ton of creatures and can just turn them sideways. Whereas Marasatron doesn't really have that in it. Like it's got Muldrifters and like Rolling Thunders. So I don't know. I think it's a very interesting thing to see, like one very prominent toolboxy deck that just kind of felt a little underpowered at this type of event, and see another toolbox deck that does not see a lot of time online really just kind of do great at the event. Like one of the tournaments I played in, friend of the show Alex Ullman was there, and he played Tortured Existence to a 3-0 finish where he dropped I think one game, and we actually threw that deck together. Like the final iteration of it was like literally tossed together that morning in our hotel room. I just think that this deck is a very solid choice. And again, if you're more comfortable with another deck, don't just play Tortured Existence, because I don't know, like I don't want to come off like I'm saying that this is like a tier 1 paper strategy, but I think if this is a deck that appeals to you, but you've always gone, oh, well, it doesn't do well online, I think this is your chance to just slam this thing in and just be like, all right, now is your time to shine, Tortured Existence. Like,
also,
let's
don't
get
forget,
those in there.
J Siri will pay you if you do well in the event with it.
Yeah,
that's right. I said it. Sorry, J Siri.
You've completely sold close friend of the show up the river completely. Well done.
Hey, he shouldn't have failed to deliver. Just kidding. He won't. He's good for it.
All right, but that said, are there any other decks you can think of that you would potentially consider for one of these events that might not be obvious picks, like beyond just like tier 1?
I'm gonna say it. Affinity.
All right, what do you like about Affinity in this
I
more
I
varied metagame?
I like that you can just win. There are some decks that just can't beat you. You're just gonna win because you have 4/4s and they don't, and you have Fling and they don't have counter spells. So I think Affinity is a fine choice. It's definitely a more volatile choice than the ones we've mentioned so far. But the deck with the accidental "Oops, I win" button is pretty solid.
Yeah, I think that is actually a pretty solid one, especially if your opponent if you're running into a bunch of non-blue opponents. I feel like your chances of doing well in that event go up exponentially. But even if you do, you still have game against decks like Delver. So I would not be upset by that. That said, Gorilla Shaman still real, even though it is $3 in paper. People will show up with them. So, don't please don't come running to us when you lose to one of those things.
Or do I'll sympathize very heavily.
Yeah, I mean it. That's Affinity's whole thing. It has to take the fact that it is one of the fastest decks with the fact that it does have a card that just kind of locks it out of the game in the format. So, all right.
Your life burns faster. Sorry.
Any other lists that you think are worth mentioning for this type of event that people should have an eye on, or even a list that you think is just miserable for this type of event and you shouldn't be considering?
I don't know. Just play something fun. I think at the end of the day, play something fun. There's plenty of tier 1 decks, but there's also going to be plenty of people not playing tier 1 decks. So might as well enjoy yourself.
Yeah. I think that is, since we're diving into like the technical side of things, at the end of the day, like if you have a deck that you like, play it. I gave the example of like if you have one land spy built, go ahead, play one land spy. People will get a kick out of it. You'll have a good time. You'll get to do your thing. You'll get that moment where you get to combo off against an opponent and the hype is off the charts and people all around you are gonna stare over what on earth is this person doing, like their entire graveyard's upside down. And
that's okay.
yeah, I think that's okay. Like at the end of the day, go to these events to have fun. If you're looking to be competitive at them, I'm guessing you're probably already a Mitgo grinder. Just play the deck you feel comfortable with. Don't worry about it. Like the amount of percentage points you're going to gain on like swapping over to a deck you're less familiar with, but you think has a better chance on average, you're losing those points probably right back when you're less familiar with the minutia of how these decks play. So play what you feel comfortable with. It's the legacy effect, right? People play the same legacy deck over and over because they've got experience with it. Also, they cost thousands of dollars, but not going down that rant. So now that we've talked a little bit about deck selection, is there anything else that we want to kind of cover with this topic in terms of going to these large events, performing well in them?
Testing is important. If you have a group, that's really kind of ideal. I guess more like general GP stuff. Vegas is a fun city. I went to GP Vegas and for the second Modern Masters. It's just a fun place. It's a fun place to be. Even if gambling is not your thing, check out the buffets. Go see a show. Like the city is fun. This whole city is built on having fun. So walk the drag. I didn't even I gambled like maybe a little bit, but mostly I just walked the drag. I explored the casinos. I had a great time. It's a pretty cheap city, all things considered. Like certainly cheaper than a lot of other places. Your room is probably not super expensive. The flight there is like less than $100, or at least it was for me, less than $100. Like it's a cheap city to have fun in and explore. If gambling's your thing, of course you can do that there. But I wish I had played a little bit less Magic and taken some more time to have fun in the city.
Yeah. Also, there's artists at these events. Go say hi to them. Get your card signed if that's your thing. There's all sorts of fun things to do at these events, and there's
go to a buffet. Go to a buffet somewhere in Vegas. You will not be disappointed. That is like the number one thing I did.
Yeah. The other thing is there's side events firing constantly. If you want to go and like Channel Fireball has been doing a great job with GPs and getting on-demand events. If you can find 7 other people who want to draft a set and they have a box of it, you can all go over to a booth and say, "Hey, I've got 7 people here. We would like to fire a draft together. Can we do that?" And they'll go, "Give me your DCI number and some money and we can make this happen." So just remember there's a lot to do. there are these big scale Pauper events, and definitely if you're going to them, play in them. Let us know how they were. Like, we'd love to hear your experiences with these large scale events, but go and have fun. At the end of the day, we can't tell you how to have fun and enjoy yourself, but hopefully this episode gives you kind of insight into tips and tricks for showing up at these large scale events, because they are different than MitGo. They are different than your small scale F&Ms if you have access to those. But end of the day, go have fun, enjoy yourself. If you're in Vegas or Roanoke, you'll probably have a good time. All right. I know this is a little bit on the shorter side of episodes, but I do know that Adrian does have the first episode of Commontary to record pretty much as soon as we end this recording. So we're going to cut this one a little short. Commontary should be coming out, would you say, within the next week, Adrian? Do you think that's fair?
Soon to a theater near you.
Yeah, I no solid dates, but once we get the first episode out, we'd love to hear your feedback on it. We'd love to incorporate feedback that we think is realistic and, continue forward with this. We might throw something, I don't know, like a bonus goal on the Patreon that if we hit a certain number, we'll do something special. But the point is, video content of people playing Pauper is coming soon. And I'm really excited to see where it goes. I'm kind of a little hands off on this first one, so I'm interested. It's going to be neat to see what happens, and I hope that you will all stick around for the ride.
Yeah, I'll take us out. Thanks for joining us today. This podcast is brought to the support of our patrons, especially Pyrison. Thank you for being a patron. Consider supporting us just like Pyrison if you like the show. Check this video or the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. We'd like to remind you for listening to this on a platform with reviews. They're always appreciated because they boost our visibility. If you've got a deck list or an idea for a topic, you can contact us either via our website or by emailing us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Special thanks to my LGS Pat's Games and Mike's LGS JP Comics, and of course L. He does our theme song Quantitative. You can find that and other great tracks over at Color Commentary over at SoundCloud.net/ELLELLELL. Till next week, this is Adrian and Mike, and we are signing off for Color Commentary.